So welcome everybody to today's presentation, the first part in a three-part webinar series on what is quality or how to find news that you can trust. Today's presentation is on what is quality journalism. As we're going through this environment of disinformation and misinformation, it's getting harder and harder to figure out what's reliable, what's credible, and what you can trust. And we hope that today's presentation can help you navigate those waters. So let's get into it. I'm a journalist and marketing communications professional. I started at the Chicago Sun-Times. I grew up on the west side of Chicago, and so reading the Sun-Times was like the biggest biggest joy in the world for me. I was a White Sox fan. And so the opportunity to work for my, hometown newspaper meant a lot to me. And it meant that I got to cover the communities that I grew up in. Joining the NLP now, I want to bring my experience as a journalist and the things that I saw in my community to the work that I do. I really want to center on marginalized communities and help amplify the voices of Black and Brown people. So enough about me and my career. And clearly you can see all the bear stuff in the background. I love Chicago, but enough about me. Let's talk more about the NLP. The News Literacy Project has a plethora of resources, tools, and guides for you to become more news literate. If you're an educator, a young person as a student, or even just the general public, we encourage you to be curious about our resources. They're all free. They're all easily accessible. And we want to put them in your hands so that you can use them and play around with them. If you happen to be connected with educators or teachers or people connected with the school system and they're interested in this type of work, we please encourage you to connect them with us. We would love to help them be more plugged in with what we're doing at the News Literacy Project. Again, you can check us out at newslit.org. So a little bit about our mission. The News Literacy Project is a nonpartisan national education nonprofit. We provide programs and resources for educators and the public so that they can learn the skills and tools needed to be smart and active consumers of news. In this, our vision is that we embed news literacy in the American educational experiences so that people of all backgrounds and ages can identify credible sources of news and be able to distinguish the different types of misinformation so that they can be empowered to equally participate in civic life in their communities and in our country. So, at the NLP, we describe news. One of our key terms for it is that it's information that informs you through fair and impartial reporting about local, national, international events, people of note like celebrities and athletes, special events that are happening, right? Those things make up what is news. So as a person, right, and somebody that might not be aligned with the journalism industry or have worked in the news industry, I think a very reasonable question to ask yourself now as you're trying to sift through what's credible, right, and what you can trust is literally like what makes the news, right? That's a legitimate question. And how can you, how do you determine what's newsworthy, right? How do you decide what's worthy of being covered in the news for yourself? Well, at news organizations, the way that they look at newsworthiness is a determination made up by multiple newsroom leaders, right? It's not just one person calling the shots. It's usually a team of people, the leaders in the newsroom, who come up with these decisions. And these decisions are based upon a number of factors that include things like who's it affecting, the prominence of it, how big the event, and then also things like how much coverage is appropriate, right? Some stories can be told in 400 words. Others can be told in 850 words. Sometimes for more investigative pieces, it takes months, if not years, in order to really uncover what's going on and to track the progress being made. And so that decision is also up to the newsroom leaders. So these factors that determine news judgment and newsworthiness are timeliness. How relevant is this to this moment in time? How important is something to the readers and the audience? Like, what's the prominence of it? How big is this thing? Then you got things, I think one of the things that people really think just makes up the news is how unusual something it is. And that is kind of important at times, right? You want something out of the ordinary, something that makes people, excited, right? Something that piques their curiosity. And so oftentimes the most prominent stories have some combination of all of these things, right? The things that are prioritized the most have a combination of a lot of these things. But in some cases, it just takes one of these things for it to be newsworthy. So the next question that you might ask yourself as we're in this age of mis and disinformation and this environment of it, right? What makes a news source credible, right? If we know what makes news, what actually makes something credible? What can you trust? What can you rely on? Well, against public, public perception and what people have said about the media, most journalists and reputable news organizations hold themselves by standards, right? And at the News Literacy Project, we focus in on the 7 standards of quality journalism to evaluate that process. These things include elements like citing multiple credible sources, right? There's not one side to any story. There's multiple sides sometimes. And so in order to really get to the heart of the issue, you have to really be able to bring the people to the table who know the most about something or are the most affected by something. Another critical element of ethical journalism is the avoidance of bias, literally trying to present the facts in the proper and necessary context, right? Without leaning one way or the other. And then also, I think it's important to note that, I won't go through all these, but it's also important to know the verification process. Fact checking is part of ethical journalism, right? They edit themselves, they fact check themselves. If it's credible and it's something that, you can deem trustworthy, it will show you the work that they are doing, right? They'll show you where they got the results and they'll correct themselves when they make mistakes. So some of the signs of quality journalism can be attributed to pretty much really two big instances, and that's transparency and accountability, right? You want, in a big scale process, you want transparency in everything that you do as journalists, because that's how we show people our work. That's how we invite them into the work, so they can have credibility in us. So what does transparency look like for a journalist or a news organization? Well, in every news report, you should at least be able to see who reported this piece and when. Sometimes it's by multiple people, by multiple newsrooms, and the date of it is actually important too, right? You want to know how current this information is. Also, you want to know how this conversation was conducted, right? The interviews in this story, were they done by telephone? Were they done by email? Were they done in person? These type of communication styles all indicate different things, right? In different contexts. So you want to be aware of that and show that in your work, and a good reputable news organization will do so. Things like disclosing relationships between sources, subjects, and stories and the organization is also important. Like the Washington Post, who's owned by Jeff Bezos now, and their stories about Amazon, they literally write in bold letters, we're owned by Jeff Bezos, so that people can know that, yes, we are owning this. Like, we know we're owned by him and we're not trying to get around that, but we want to do credible reporting on things that matters and to hold people of power to account. And so if you look to the right, the image to the right is a copy of a handbook of values and principles for the New York Times. This is important because it really outlines the scope and the magnitude of how much, they adhere to their standards and ethics. If you're just going through some of these, they even mentioned the personal relationship with sources, right? Accepting hospitality from sources, right? And then dealing with competition. All these things they go over. It's not, there are a lot of public perception around the fact that journalists aren't ethical and they don't have any standards, but at a credible journalism and news organization, they will have these standards and they hold themselves to this standard. So the second part, accountability, really hinges upon corrections, right? And really allowing, bringing people into the process of accountability by showing that, hey, we messed up. We said something that wasn't true. We own that. We want to do better, but we're not perfect, right? Human beings are perfect, aren't perfect, right? So journalists make mistakes too. It's unfortunate because our mistakes can be magnified to a level that a lot of people wouldn't in their careers. But for journalists, it's put there out there for everybody, right? These type of corrections are put there for everybody to see, and they're magnified. According to a study by Dartmouth College and the News Collab, many young adults actually have less trust in news media when it issues corrections, right? But that goes against what journalism is actually trying to do. It's trying to be accountable for the mistakes that they made. But as the co-founder of New Collab said, and addressing the article, he doesn't want journalists to be discouraged by this type of discovery, but offer it as an opportunity to really underscore the value of facts, right? To really underscore that it's important to get it right, even if it means I got to correct myself and embarrass myself to some degree. I have to get it right, and I owe that to the people, right? As a public service. And so another way, I guess, on an individual level to see, how journalists go through accountability and holding themselves to ethics, a good way to look at that is a reporter's fact check. And this is shared with us by one of our friends from the Chicago Tribune when she was writing about the Laquan McDonald case. So if you basically, to break this down, if you look at the highlighted portions of this is where the fact check really comes into place. And I'll start with the very first one to the left that's highlighted, the name Jason Van Dyke, right? Names are extremely important in journalism because if you're off just by a letter or, a space somewhere, you're talking about someone completely different and not someone that you're intending to talk about. So you're incredible that way because you're uncredible that way because you're not actually even talking about that person. So names are the basic part of journalism and fact checking, but is one of the most important parts. It's the part that people really, really want. It's the part that can easily overturn your credibility, right? The next thing is dates. You're documenting history. You want to make sure that you're factually correct, right? If you're incorrect about the dates, it's kind of hard to deem you credible, right? How can somebody use this as a credible source years down the line if you actually got the time and dates wrong? It's important to do that. And then if you look at other things like the age of the subject, that also the age of the person in the story, that also plays a part into getting it right. If you say he's 18, right, that takes him away from being a teenager anyway, but you're talking about a completely different person. It might be an 18-year-old Laquan McDonald in the world, but the 17-year-old one that you're talking about that was gunned down by Jason Van Dyke is the one that you're trying to talk about. So age is also extremely important. So all of the things that make something right or wrong as far as facts are concerned are usually checked and edited in credible journalism organizations. And it starts a lot of times on the reporter level. This is a self-edit that a reporter does. Also, being able to understand the difference in news and opinion is so key to understanding news literacy. So opinion is information that persuades you through logic-based arguments to adapt a certain point of view. Oftentimes we see this as different things in journalism. You see op-eds, you see opinion pieces, commentary, things like that. So the problem with the issue with being able to distinguish the two is that a lot of times they can look like the same thing in today's media environment, right? The same topics that are covered in news are opined about, moments later, not just, weeks or days now, it's moments later that they're being read about. So the one on the left, the posting on the left, is one that tells you the 5 W's of a story: who, what, when, where, how, right? Trying to get down to the facts. The post on the right is an opinion story. And we know this because of the language around it, right? For instance, the word perspective, and this is where the journalism industry really has to improve. For some reason, journalism or journalists think, or newsrooms think that perspective is a word that everybody understands as opinion. But it's more of a jargony word that journalists use to describe what opinion is. And whereas, yes, clearly in some ways is different from the, post on the left, that perspective part doesn't really signify that it's an opinion piece. But if you do know enough about the industry, yes, you would know that. But typically most people don't. And so that's one of the things that I've definitely noticed in as far as understanding the difference between the two, is that the language really just needs to improve and journalists need to be able to identify that. So being able to tell the difference between opinion and news, credible news, is really important, but journalism organizations do both, right? They use the opinion pieces to contextualize things, to take a stance on things. Both of those things have a place in our news cycle, but it's important to be able to distinguish both, right? One is trying to persuade you to feel something, one is trying to inform you. But what we do want you to be aware of are the sources that are trying to manipulate you and not persuade or inform you. So opinion is trying to persuade you through fact-based arguments, right? Propaganda is trying to promote a single view and discrediting anything that opposes it. Opinion is something that can be evaluated for its strengths and its weaknesses, but also acknowledges other viewpoints. It can be challenged. Propaganda, on the other hand, relies on our emotional responses. So to give you a definition attached to it, information that provokes you often by using false or distorted information to manipulate your emotions. So some of the ways that this breaks down, and this is brought to you by the museum, is a number of techniques that they use. So simplification, and we see this oftentimes, right? When it comes to propaganda, it makes a really complicated issue seem simple, right? It's easier to believe in the simple things because the hard things, we don't have enough knowledge about some things to really understand how deep they go. So sometimes it's just easier to believe the simple things, right? And then I think and not to go through all these, but as you look at political times in our country, or times where there's big elections, there's a lot of propaganda meant to be divisive, right? To broaden the gap between political parties. And so when you think about this, that really can show you where the distinction between something that might be trying to inform you credibly and persuade you credibly versus something trying to manipulate you. So in this example, this is a propaganda site called Natural News. If you look at it, just glance at it, it looks like a news site, right? It looks like the things that you'll see on news sites. They have audiobooks and interviews and a podcast and all these different things. And it's shaped up and it's literally laid out like most newspaper or news organizations. But when you really look at the details and you notice some of these headlines, you'll notice that they're very inflammatory and divisive and problematic, all those words, right? So for instance, in the middle of the page, you see another in bold words, another deranged transgender caught planning mass extinction mass shooting against children arrested with communist manifesto on kill list. Where did that even come from? How there is no facts behind that. They're not attributing it to anything. There's so much problematic stuff on this page. Everything is explosive and incendiary. It's trying to mimic the look of an actual newspaper or a news site, but it's clearly not that. News organizations don't say these things. They don't have these broad sweeping accusations without having proof and evidence behind them. But the key is to understand that there are different ways that you can be manipulated, and there's different uses for information. News and opinion, as done credibly, is trying to inform you and persuade you in a credible way using a logical argument. This propaganda site is really just trying to play on your emotions. So with that, I'm going to bring this to a wrap. I really want to bring in our guest speakers today. I thank you all. I know that there have been some amazing questions asked in the chat. Thank you all so much for tuning in and being engaged. We'll get to the questions right after the discussion. But for now, I'd like to bring on Molly Parker and Brandon Pope. Hey, Molly, how's it going?
Hey, how are you doing? Thanks for having us.
Pretty good. 1 second.
You see me?
Oh, hey, how's it going, Brandon?
I'm good, man. How you doing?
Awesome, awesome, man. It's great to have both of you all with us today.
I'm live from the field today.
Okay, cool. Can you hear me all right?
I can, yeah.
So, yes, we can hear you good. So Brandon is the host of On the Block, powered by Block Club Chicago. He's also the president of the National Association of Black Journalists in the Chicago chapter. Thank you, Brandon, for joining us. And then also we have joining us today, Molly Parker, who is a ProPublica Distinguished Fellow and an investigative journalist. And we're really looking forward to our discussion today. So with that, we're going to get right into it, guys. We're going to get right into these questions. So Brandon, you spent a majority of your career in TV news. You kind of came up in that arena. So what is the process like? And can you talk to us about what's the process like to get something covered on air? And how do broadcast reporters typically go about sourcing and finding stories?
That's a good question, man. So, broadcast, much like many newsrooms, we have a system where, me as a reporter or an anchor, I have, producers I have to check in with, editors I have to check in with, kind of the same kind of a word, producer, editor, both kind of do the same thing, the organizing of the structure of the news product. So for us producers, they organize the show, they make decisions on content, they make decisions on what goes in their shows and what doesn't. So ultimately, I have to answer to them. So for me, I always think about, one, what are they going to check off the box? Two, I think about what's going to be the best for our audience. And that's how I figure out what kind of stories I want to do. When it comes to actually vetting and figuring out, is their source reliable or not? It comes down to the basic one of, I hit the socials. I go to Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, see if they have any of those. Verification doesn't mean as much as it used to now because of Twitter Blue and things like that. But I'm still able to, through Google and other means, find ways to verify who people actually are. I'm being moved around real quick, so sorry, guys.
No, thank you. No, that's all good. And I'll jump to Molly real quick. Molly, in your time producing critical investigative journalism, what's your approach to finding sources that will provide your readers with the most context and accuracy on an issue?
When we work on a really big project, my approach is to talk to as many people as possible that are knowledgeable about a situation, both what we sometimes refer to as real people, and not to be confused because we're all real people, but I'm talking about people who are maybe not necessarily in the field or business as experts or lawmakers or what have you, but are affected by an issue. And so we would make an attempt to speak to as many people as possible that are sorry, I'm having a motorcycle go by, as many people as possible that can share their stories to make sure this isn't a one-off situation and that other people are also experiencing whatever it is that we're looking into. And then likewise, on the flip side of that, we would go to lots of different experts and test our theories. Here's what we're hearing from people, and we would get feedback from, like I said, many different people and perspectives about why something is happening and where the shortcomings are and who or what entities, what government agencies might be responsible for correcting those problems or the failures that exist.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. I'm going to start out, for the sake of time, I want to make sure that I get to some Q&A questions as well. So I'm going to sprinkle some of those into the conversation. But I would love to know, What is you all's stance on objectivity? And either of you can answer this, both of you can, or I mean, neither of you can, but you can, either of you can answer this. What's your stance on objectivity? And do you think it's still important to the newsmaking process?
I'll start here if you'd like. I'm seeing feedback that my audio might be muffled and muddy, so hopefully it's a little bit better. I don't know the Wi-Fi here, so I'm on my 4G on my phone. So objectivity itself is a bit of a myth. Like, no one is truly objective. So I I think that for us as journalists, our goal should not be objectivity. I always say your goal should be fairness. Fairness to all sides, fairness to everybody, making sure everybody's heard out, making sure you got your facts straight, and giving people a chance to answer for different things. That's just being fair, right? Objectivity, I think, is just an outdated notion. And oftentimes, what's objective to some is not objective to others, right? And traditionally, objectivity has been framed in a way that's harmed a lot of marginalized communities. Because we've tended to overall in the journalism industry, media industry, framed objectivity through kind of like what does overall what do white people think is objective? What do white cis men think is objective? But lived experience gives you bias, right? If you're a woman and you're covering reproductive rights, I mean, you care about that. You're invested in that. That doesn't mean you're ill-equipped to tell the story. Doesn't mean you can't be fair. It just means you bring perspective, and that perspective should be embraced. If you're a Black person or a Latino person covering an issue specific to that community, it's not biased at all to have a stake in that, right? You want to be able to have those perspectives. It makes our journalism better. It makes our coverage better, and it's better for our audience as well. So I think we as an industry overall have done a lot of harm by sticking to a rigid objectivity approach, balance here. Well, this person says this person says this, you decide. Well, no, we have to be able to add color, add context, and bring our own unique perspectives to things. So I say strive for fairness, not objectivity.
Thank you, Brandon. Molly, do you have anything to add?
I mean, I think Brandon's hitting on some very, very important points. And we've had newsrooms that, for years were largely white, at the time, even largely male, but we've still been really slow to diversify our newsrooms. And so sure, it's easy to say, well, we're being very objective, but that has traditionally been through a framework or a lens of, a white person. And I think that does raise big questions about what it means to how we approach stories, like what one person thinks is a radical idea to reform, say police departments, just because it's radical to you, maybe that's just because you haven't been listening to communities that don't look like you, especially talking about, white people in particular, thinking of things as radical simply because they haven't experienced it. And so, yeah, I think that's super important, that we have diverse newsrooms for that very reason. And I think as far as fairness, that just means, if you are, it doesn't mean everyone gets 50% of your article or your newscast. It means that, if you are holding someone accountable for a clear failure that you've showed all the receipts on, that you do give them, time to respond. Certainly, we don't do drive-bys. We don't surprise people with what's coming out. We let people respond, but it doesn't mean that we have to remove ourselves, I think, entirely from the equation. And like Brandon said, it's not technically possible as human beings.
Excellent. Thank you both for answering that. I know that was kind of tough with the way how the perceptions around that goes today. But the next question comes from Jonathan in the chat. He says, how important is it for the opinion and editorial staff to be separate from the reporting staff? Or is it?
Yeah, I'll take that one first. I think it's very important. And I think you have that more in newsrooms, but certainly in big, large network TVs too, where you have talk news, opinion. And it is important to keep them separate and to be like in a newspaper, to be very clear, this is the opinion page. This is the news page. And I think on social media, those lines get a little blurry to the average reader, and just making sure even when you repost something on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, that you're very clear. I do think it's important. And I think that as news people, we sometimes assume people know things that they don't know if they're not in the business about what is opinion and what is news.
Cool. I see another really cool discussion question about selection bias and newsworthiness. Are you guys comfortable with talking about selection bias? I mean, I can address it if you're not familiar with it, but selection bias is us actively choosing what we want to read, and not choosing not to read other things. So like if I lean left, if I feel like I lean left as politically, I'll read MSNBC, left things, things that are left of center, and won't read anything else. So could you all speak to selection bias in this regard to newsworthiness? Does that play a part in how people receive news or how you guys give it?
Yeah, I'll take this one. So when it comes to selection bias, something that I think is a huge crisis right now, and it's kind of swirled into our misinformation crisis. People seek out not facts, but they seek out things they confirm or make them feel better about what they think or believe. And because of that, you have sites, programs, podcasts that call themselves news, parade themselves as news, may even have news in the name, but are literally the opposite of what that is. Social media is a big reason for that. People have more options than ever before. They have more channels than ever before to go to. And so with the onset of cable news, MSNBC leaning more to the left, Fox News leaning more to the right, that kind of jumped right forward to I just lost my thought here for a second. That jumped us right forward to social media, and where people can find even more channels to jump into and get more confirmation bias. It's a big challenge. Has it personally impact me as a journalist? Honestly, I think that people tend to paint with a broad brush, and because of that, they view media overall as if it's supposed to lean one way or another, without understanding that that's not exactly how it's supposed to be. So I think it's important that we reestablish that balance, that we help people understand what important and credible sites and resources are for journalism. And it's a big crisis right now. People are just relying on YouTube and stuff like that. And so honestly, I think it starts with our kids. It starts with programs in schools. It starts with media literacy classes and programs with high schools, middle schools. I'd say start young, because these kids are on social media younger and younger. They're on YouTube younger and younger. They're now getting news from TikTok, from Instagram. The Shade Room, y'all heard of it? People get their news from there, and the Shade Room has all kinds of fake stuff on there. So it's just really important that our young people understand the importance of real, verifiable information and content.
Awesome. Molly, do you have anything to add?
Just that, I think that these social media networks obviously have been capitalized on that and made us, the more we read from a certain bucket, the more they funnel that into our stream, and we become siloed and living in an echo chamber. And, obviously just encouraging people to, branch out as much as possible and read from a broad array of credible news sources is very important.
Okay, cool. We're going to jump into another question from the chat. Someone asks, how much of your work as a journalist, how much of that has changed in the wake of social media to maintain trust with your audiences?
I think social media has made it very hard, right? Social media is like a double-edged sword, as we know. I mean, it's a great resource for finding sources, for one thing. I use it all the time to find people with specific issues that have, there's all kinds of search functions for people who live in a certain area where you might be writing about, or who have posted about a certain issue, that allows you to really broaden your source base. And that's awesome. But obviously social media has also siloed us, made more and more people get their news from social media rather than going to original news sites. And so, as we've just talked about, there's all these algorithms that start to understand who you are. So if you're someone who's like looking into conspiracy theory websites, you keep getting fed that, right? And there's been a lot of information out there about how you can see how people can really begin to narrow their life view and even buy into some pretty bizarre conspiracy theories. Like if you're constantly being barraged with the world is flat, the world is flat, the world is flat, well, hey, maybe you start to, it's kind of understandable why people start to think a certain way. So yeah, I think social media has been very good in many ways, but also incredibly damaging, I think, to public trust and to journalism as a whole.
Absolutely. The next question comes from, oh, this is an anonymous question. Sorry, no one posted their name to it. But how do you deal with unnamed sources? Oh, I'm sorry, this is a question from Sean in the chat. Sorry, Sean. How do you guys go about dealing with unnamed sources? What's the process like in newsrooms? How does that look?
It really varies newsroom to newsroom. Me as a TV journalist, I don't have as many uses for unnamed sources because a lot of what we do is visual. So we need people to put their face on it, right? And put their audio and words to it. But there are situations where you hear something, you get information from a verifiable source, but that source cannot, for the sake of their own career or whatever, be identified. In those instances, a lot of it's about trust that the news manager has with that journalist in particular, and making sure that, yes, you know, they're not just making stuff up out of thin air, that they have the receipts to back it up. But oftentimes you have sit downs with your news managers and you bring up the receipts and you have transparent conversations. You show the text message to the news manager or the email or whatever you're communicating through. If it's a phone call, then hey, you just have to have that kind of trust with the news manager. You build that credibility and trust over time. I haven't had a lot of situations like that, but there have been a few where I get some tips about something, especially in this mayor's race we just had here in Chicago. Get some information about something or know that some endorsements are coming. But I can't tell you who did it. I can just tell you that I know it, right? From very verifiable sources. So really, it's just about credibility and trust within the newsroom itself. But also, we as journalists have to do a better job of building that trust within our communities themselves, our audience, our readers, our viewership. I think one reason why you have the stigma against mainstream media and local media right now is that when we say sources say, people don't understand the process. They're not hearing what we're doing, what I'm explaining to you right now. They would benefit from hearing that, which I'm glad we have people on right now that are actually able to hear that, right? But if we can get more people to understand that, pull back the veil a little bit into what exactly journalism is, because right now, a lot of people out there think we just make up stuff.
Right.
When they see sources say, especially when it comes to political stuff, people that are, in Trump land, they have a stigma against the media that you could say you can understand why they do. They don't understand how you come up with sources say, sources tell me. So we have to do a better job of explaining that to folks.
Right. And what I'm hearing from you is that the process in the newsroom is at least one of your manager knows who this person is. They know their identity. They know they're credible. At least one person, if not all of your newsroom managers, know that this person isn't anonymous. They know this person. Right.
In most cases. And sometimes there's ways you still have to protect your source. So you give a little more information, but maybe not the person's name. Like maybe I say, an elected official who is the representative for this community told me this, right? That should give enough information or a roundabout ballpark, right? So you have to do that before you go on air with something. Absolutely, to get those checks and balances from your team, from your editors, your producers, your managers, and make sure that everybody's on the same page. And you're not just like going out here with anything, because anybody can say anything. You do want to make sure what you're hearing is from a trusted source. And here's the other thing I want to specify too. You don't just take the source's word. There's very trustworthy sources out there, but you need to have a backup source. It's very important that you have other sources out there You know, just because they have a high ranking title or name, they can make up stuff too. Sometimes they intentionally want to make up stuff and put it out there to the press or media so that it's put out there and it creates smoke screen and stuff like that, strategy and stuff like that. So you want to make sure that you're doing the work as well and verifying information too. But if you have things from trusted sources and you understand and you know that it's coming from a verifiable source, make sure you have that conversation with your team. And then once again, we got to pull back the veil for the public and let them know how we're getting to the storytelling process.
Absolutely. And Molly, as an investigative reporter, you have to deal with very sensitive information all the time. Can you speak a little bit about what that process is like for you when you have to, go with an anonymous source or pitch that to your newsroom leaders?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think that the bar should be very, very high for anonymous sources. I hear Brandon saying that too. It should be the exception and not the rule. And there are lots of things we can do when someone wants to be anonymous. I've worked with people who at first express apprehension about being on the record. I worked with a source, a very sensitive story that dealt with her mental health for a year before she decided to go with her name. Before that, she wanted to go with maybe a pseudonym or, maybe just no name. And the story lacked credibility, right? And so a lot of it is building that trust. And if you have to do it under pressure, that can be very difficult. But in an ideal situation, you can convince people and work with them and be transparent with them about this is what you're saying in the story, work with them about, maybe what level of sensitive details you share. It's not just one interview and this is out. But I think that generally in the news, we've gotten way too loose with sources, with anonymous sources, because I think there's so much skepticism out there that we need to be way more careful. I even get frustrated, but there's this whole thing in the government now where even spokespeople who are paid to do their job to represent an agency are like, you can quote me, but I would rather you say, a senior official within XYZ agency. And I've been pushing back on that because why? I mean, people want to know who you are. They want to know that, it's not that you're blaming this person, they're just an agent of the agency, but this idea that we're just going to go with all of these unnamed sources is really troubling to me. And so again, I feel like you should make sure there has to be a really valid reason, and you're going to tell readers what it is. This person's life is in jeopardy if someone knows who it is. They're going to lose their job. I think that one is sometimes adequate and sometimes not. I mean, that's not a reason to let them just rail on their boss, right? So, I mean, it has to be serious enough where other people's maybe lives or health or whatever it is at risk as well. Right? So the information they're providing has to be not self-serving to them, and there has to be a valid reason. And you have to be able to, like you said, tell at least one editor and you to make that decision with you. And you have to decide that there's no other way to get this information. And then, and only then, to me, is that bar met that there might be a reason to have an anonymous source in the story.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much for unpeeling the curtain, pulling the curtain back on that. I think that that's something that a lot of people wonder about often. But in the interest of time, I'm going to ask them one more question. They have graciously stayed on for a little bit longer, so I thank you all so much. Brandon has also actually been really busy covering the DNC convention that's coming to Chicago, so excuse him for traveling and all that, but they're journalists and they're working right now, so we do appreciate you being able to get us in today, man. So the last question for today, guys, comes from Emma in the chat, who says, do you think that there's a space for communities to get involved in community journalism, like reporting on their own stories if they accept and adhere to the ethics of journalism? And either of you can ask it. Either of you can answer it.
I think there's absolutely an avenue for it. The importance is the last thing you said, making sure that they're sticking to the tenets. So there needs to be an education and training process there. I think, there's been a general kind of feeling from people lately with the onset of social media and the ease of getting microphones and stuff like that anybody can be a journalist, right? But the truth of the matter is, it does take training. It does take certain skills. And it's not something that just anybody can do. But I think that anybody can take those steps, right? And I think community should be empowered to do that. That's why we have community newspapers. That's why we have community voices, to be able to do that. People that step up, learn, and then take on that role. So I'm all about that. I think we need that because too long journalism has been, the positions that people have in journalism have been held by people that come from privilege. And so if we're going to demystify that, we have to open up the access for sure. We just got to make sure though that those key tenets, the ethics, accuracy, truth, that all of those are being adhered to, and that there's a baseline understanding of those things overall.
And Molly, you work a lot in community. I'm sure a lot of people are really interested in the investigative reports that you come up with and are really inspired by the work that you do. What would you tell somebody that came up to you that wanted to get involved in community journalism?
I mean, I think anyone can learn the craft of journalism. It is a craft. It is a profession. It isn't, necessarily something you go out with no experience and do well in a day. I couldn't, I mean, it takes years really to kind of understand and perfect the craft, and certainly not even there yet, right? So it's like any job that takes skill. You don't have to have a journalism degree. You don't have to have a college degree necessarily. I mean, there have been some wonderful examples of prison putting out newspapers. Again, I think it's about knowing the skills and being committed to the things that we're talking about, the ethics that we're talking about. I would encourage anyone. I think the future is going to be traditional media newsrooms are shrinking, and those holes are going to be filled by people who want to get involved in the business, startups, nonprofits. There's grants out there to support journalism. I think it's just important maybe to, get a mentor, work with someone who knows the craft. If you want to start a newspaper in your community though, and you want to be a journalist, I absolutely think that I encourage that. This isn't a job for the elite. This isn't, you have to, it's not a licensed profession either. But it takes practice and skill. So if you're committed to that, I think, I think you should do it. And the more journalists we have out here, the better.
Awesome. No, I completely agree. I think that, seeing the work that journalism and credible news sources can do for communities and keeping people informed on the issues so they can be, informed voters and participate in their communities is hugely important to me, and clearly is very important to you two as well. So I thank you two for spending the time with us today, for the wonderful discussion and the amazing answers. You guys really helped us peel the curtain back on what the process of journalism looks like. And I also want to thank everybody for tuning in and asking amazing questions. I'm so sorry we weren't able to get to all of you guys' great, amazing questions. We definitely want to be cognizant of the time, and we're appreciative of working journalists being able to join us on these webinars. And so the next week will be the part 2 in the session, where we'll go into understanding news media bias with our panelists, Amnis Davis of the Harvey World Herald and Stephanie Casanova of Signal Cleveland. We're really excited about that conversation. And before you all actually leave today, we have a small request. We have a little survey that we would love for you all to fill out if you have time. It should take no more than 3 minutes. I'll put it onto the screen. 1 second. Again, thank you all so much for joining us today. I can't wait for another great session next week. And until then, I will see you guys soon. Thank you so much.